flourish, and I think we put at risk who we are as the world's only military and economic superpower if we put at risk these civil liberties. So that philosophy illuminates some of my votes. I voted against the Patriot Act. I voted for it the first time. It may help us in apprehending a potential terrorist or two, but at what cost? When they want to know what you read in the library, they can have a roving wiretap. They can listen in on your phone, and you don't know about it. You know, I just am so jealous of protecting our civil liberties. If I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the side of protecting our civil liberties. So although I really support education, I've taught for 20 years. This is the 60th anniversary of my doctorate, by the way, from the University of Maryland. Yeah, 60 years ago. You know, the federal government, I don't think ought to be, unless you want to amend the Constitution. Now, if you want to amend the Constitution, I'm A-OK. We've done that 27 times. I'm A-OK to have that debate. I'm just not okay ignoring the Constitution, because if you can ignore it to do what you see as good things, tomorrow somebody may be ignoring it to do something that's not good. So I just, you know, it's fair to protect us. I just want to bear protecting us. Other questions, comments? Yes, Stu, thank you.
My name is Will Giles, and I'm a junior at Bishop Walsh. With national debt passing $16 trillion this week, how big of an issue do you feel it is to control spending?
You know, we do polling, everybody does polling, and the number one issue generally in the polling is jobs and economy. It's a little unfair to put jobs and economy and deficit and debt in the same list of things, because one is a very short term. Clearly today the big problem is jobs and economy, isn't it? But long term, deficit and debt is going to overshadow that. And one of the polls we did, deficit and debt was a bigger problem for people than jobs and economy. Let me give you an example of how big this problem is. You heard about the sequester, which is a doomsday thing, and a meat axe approach, and all sorts of hyperbole involved with this. If sequester occurs, defense, the Department of Defense, will be cut. National security, or what, I forget the collective term they use, is half of it, but that includes Homeland Security and our intelligence agencies and stuff. The actual Department of Defense part of it is a little over $50 billion. We spend about 20% of our money on defense in this country. So if you wanted to say, gee, if we're going to cut defense that much, you ought to be fair and cut everybody the same percentage, which means instead of cutting just $50 billion, you'd be cutting 5 times that, or $250 billion across the whole spectrum of things like Medicare or Medicaid, everything. That's considered draconian and impossible. We couldn't possibly do that. That represents about 20%, maybe a little bit more, about 20% of our deficit next year. Now, if it's draconian and impossible, if you absolutely cannot cut the deficit by 20%, how do you ever get there? The Republican budget Congress ago was Paul Ryan's roadmap, and I signed on to that, and 6 other Republicans signed on to it. And that was it. 7 of us signed on to his roadmap Congress ago. He reintroduced it at the beginning of this Congress, and 13 of us signed on. And then it, in effect, became the Republican budget. And of course, if it's a Republican budget, you're a Republican, you voted for the Republican budget. Its plan was so austere that Congress, only 7 of us had the courage to sign on, and this time only 13 of us signed on before it became the Republican roadmap. It doesn't balance for 28 years. And then it balances only if you are making what I think are unrealistic assumptions about economic growth. He's assuming 2.6% average economic growth. And I think with the world's energy situation, that's going to be really tough to have an average of 2.6% economic growth. And I just wish that more, this is a soluble problem. There are many families, there are many businesses that have been faced with problems like this. But they do what we appear unwilling to do, and that is to face the reality of the problem and to make the necessary cuts. And it's a huge problem. And you know, much of what I do in the Congress has nothing to do with Roscoe Bartlett. I'm 86 years old. But I have 10 kids and 18 grandkids and 2 great-grandkids. And most of what I do has to do with them. And when the first big bailout thing came up, it was George Bush's TARP thing, they called it, bailing out Wall Street. And I asked myself a very simple question. Is the temporary good we might get from this to fix a problem which we caused worth further burdening future generations, some of them yet to be born? And my answer to that question then was no. So I voted against it. And each time one of these bailout things came up, I asked myself, you know, I thought about my great-grandkids and my 18 grandkids. And I asked myself that question again. Is the temporary good we might get from this to solve a problem which we caused worth further burdening these future generations, some of them not yet born? And each time my answer was no, and so I'm one of only 17 in the Congress that's voted no on all of these bailout things. I didn't start out saying Roscoe's going to vote no on all this stuff. Just each time one came up, I asked myself what I thought for me and my family was a rational question. Should I burden them further with this? And the answer was no. Thank you for your question. It is a huge problem. And you know, we are in denial. Paul Ryan says his budget pays down the debt. I said, Paul, it doesn't balance for 28 years. How do you pay down the debt when it doesn't even balance? Oh, he says the debt becomes a smaller percentage of GDP. Now, only inside the Beltway would somebody make a statement like that. And Paul is a really nice young man. But there's something happens to you when you live inside that bubble down there. You start to see things differently than the average citizen sees them. So when he says he pays down the debt, it doesn't mean he's paying down the debt. He means that he thinks the economy is going to grow so that it's going to become a lesser percentage of the debt. You're still going to owe twice as much money, roughly, in 28 years as you owe now, even with that budget. And that's a very austere budget. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Women today are making about 77 cents to a man's dollar on the workplace. Would you sponsor a bill for equal pay?
For women? Oh, absolutely. You know, I don't know how you stop people from discriminating. That's in their head. If it's a secretary, if it's a woman, they call them a secretary. If it's a man, it's an executive assistant, and they pay the man more doing exactly the same thing. There's nobody that I know of who doesn't want equal pay for equal work, and we're getting there. But it's like all discrimination. It just takes a while. But, you know, any time there's a bill that encourages people to be gender blind when they're looking at work and pay, I vote for it, of course. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Back to the subject of the deficit. Do you think, what sort of crisis do you think would be necessary for Congress to actually take it seriously and try to solve the problem?
Oh, downgraded by Moody. The Chinese stopped buying our bonds. Yeah, I don't know what it would take. You know, we've been downgraded once already. Yeah.
Exactly.
You know, and we still haven't been brought to reality, have we? Yeah. Now, how do you get there? How do you get there? If the sequester is so draconian, it is impossible, and it cuts only roughly a fifth of the deficit. Deficit next year is going to be over $1 trillion. We don't know how much over, but over $1 trillion. This is 250. So if it's only if we limit it to $1 trillion, then it's a fourth. So in the best of all worlds, we would be, you know, cutting a fourth. If you can't cut a fourth or a fifth of the deficit, how do you ever get? And every year you wait, the debt becomes that much bigger, and the interest on the debt becomes that much bigger. So it becomes harder to cut it next year. Which is why I have never voted, unless it was encased in a big bill with a lot of other stuff, and I have never voted to raise the debt limit. When I started voting no, it was $4 trillion. Wouldn't it be nice if the debt today was $4 trillion? Remember the bumper stickers during the Reagan administration? No $1 trillion debt. How many remember the bumper stickers? No $1 trillion, no $1 trillion. And here we are at 16 and counting. And about every 6-7 hours, another $1 billion. And by the way, there's another number which is almost equally as stunning. about every 12 hours is another $1 billion increase in the trade deficit. We had a wonderful May. We bragged about it. Our deficit, I think, was only $50 billion in May. So there's no other, I'm not an economist, but neither am I an idiot. There's no other way to look at this. There's no other way to look at this as capital leaving our country, this trade deficit. Am I not right? Yeah. It comes back and buys us. 70% of our brick, 70% of our cement happen to be roughly the same number, is owned by foreigners who come back and bought us. Remember the ad? I haven't seen it recently on television. It was the in China, the Chinese students, and they're all snickering. We own them now. Remember the ad? Yeah, on television. Yeah, that really stunned my wife when she saw it. Yes, ma'am. Back
I
here,
have a
ma'am.
question. Why is it that you always refer to Reagan's administration? Everyone refers to Reagan. That's all you hear. My second question is,
Yeah.
you had me by 6 years. I taught school for 46 years.
Wow.
I've lived in this community for 80 years. How many times, were you surprised that we wear shoes up here and that we are alive up here? That you have gotten out of the circle? My other question is, you're talking about the Constitution. I would like to see you give a test to all those senators and see if they can pass.
But when I told you
As
that
I said, it's a school teacher.
as I said, when the recording clerk didn't recognize that I was reading from the Constitution, I think that kind of answers
And I
your
think
question.
you would find quite a few people, including you all, senators and representatives, couldn't pass the test either.
I would not argue with that.
Thank you.
I would not argue with that. Yeah, one of my major focuses is energy, and I tell audiences that the innocence and ignorance in our general population on energy is astounding, and we have truly representative government. That takes a moment, doesn't it?
Yes. No, I don't agree with you, because as I said, I've taught school for 46 years. I take people down to DC and everything, and it was like, oh, how long did it take you to get down there? You know, they don't even know we exist up here. How many times have you been up here to visit us since you've been running this campaign?
Oh my, I don't know.
More
Several.
so than you
Several.
ever did before.
Several. No, I go
More
as frequently as
so,
I can.
yeah.
I use every excuse to come to Mountain, Maryland.
Well,
Don't
thank
tell
you.
the other side
We
of the
welcome
district.
you.
I
We
love
welcome
the
you.
mountains.
So do
Yeah.
we. We love our mountains up
Yeah.
here too.
Yeah. Other question? Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Okay, if I as a banker was to loan money to somebody and this person broke the law, would I as a banker be responsible for that?
If you loaned them, depends on whether or not you had a controlling interest in what they were doing. If,
But I just as a bank
and
loaning
many times.
you a lot of money.
But it depends on many times, and the courts may find that you do, by the way. It depends upon whether or not you have any control over what the company does. And many times a banker will not loan money until they have some element of control. So it depends on the circumstance. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
What's your view on developing Marcellus Shale here in Western Maryland?
Oh, it's a huge resource. Pennsylvania's doing it. West Virginia's doing it. There are people here in Maryland that are sitting on Marcellus Shale who are on economic hard times. We are getting a pretty good handle on how to develop it and be environmentally responsible. I hope that Maryland shortly approves the development of Marcellus Shale. This is one of my concerns about this is that this is not the solution to our energy problem. It is a wonderful discovery that we can develop Marcellus Shale. And two things permitted us to do that. One is horizontal drilling and the other is fracking. And before we could develop those two techniques and combine them, there really wasn't any way that we were going to get this gas. And the same thing for the Bakken oil out in the west. Horizontal drilling and fracking released this from it's in what they call tight shales. It's there in tiny little pockets, and you blast this water in there with some sand in it, and you open up these things, and the sand within holds them open, and the gas can flow out. If it's oil, the oil flows out. We ought to be responsibly exploiting these reserves. If you haven't read it, They founded several years ago what I think is the most insightful speech of the last century was given by Hyman Rickover, the father of our nuclear submarine, the 15th day of May, I believe it was in 1957, to a group of physicians in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he was talking about energy. And he made a couple of observations that just seemed axiomatic. He said that in the 8,000 year recorded history, the age of oil would be but a blip. He had no idea how long the age of oil would last. But in comparison to 8,000 years, he thought it was going to be pretty short. We now have a pretty good idea how long the age of oil would last. But he said how long it lasts is important in only one regard. The longer it lasts, the more time would we have to plan an orderly transition to other sources of energy. Drill, baby, drill. You know, I just don't see that recognition that Hyman Rickover had that we need to be about planning an orderly transition to other sources of energy. 4 years and 9 months ago, I led the last Republican Codel before the Democrats took over for 4 years to China. 9 of us went to China, a bipartisan group of 9 of us went to China to talk